My name is Erin Halloway. I'm 34 years old, and for 8 years I worked double shifts as a dental hygienist, drove a car with 190,000 miles on it, and put every spare dollar into a savings account with a name I never told anyone, the house. In March of last year, I closed on a 3-bedroom bungalow on Larkspur Street for $214,000, using a down payment I had built one paycheck at a time, plus a small inheritance from my grandmother. I want to be honest about something before I tell you the rest of this. My parents didn't help me buy that house. Not with money. What they did instead was move into it 4 months later, and stay for 11. None of us knew, that spring, that a loan officer named Patricia Nguyen was going to make a routine phone call that would end everything quietly and completely. Not with a scene. With a verification question she wasn't even supposed to be asking me. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever loaned someone your patience and watched them spend it like it was theirs to begin with, comment "I've been there" below. This one's for you. I've been a dental hygienist since I was 23. It's not a job people romanticize. I spend my days asking strangers to open wider and reminding them, gently, that flossing isn't optional. But I like the steadiness of it. 2 Fridays a month, I sat down with a spreadsheet and moved money into an account at Meridian Credit Union, the same branch my grandmother had used since 1979. I didn't take vacations most years. I drove my Honda until the air conditioning stopped working and just accepted that Ohio summers would be sweaty from May through September. People who know me would tell you I'm not dramatic. I don't raise my voice. I make lists. I keep receipts, literally and otherwise. That habit, it turns out, mattered more than I could have known. I don't think people understand what 8 years of saving actually looks like from the inside, so I want to slow down on it for a moment, because it matters later. It wasn't one dramatic act of discipline. It was hundreds of small, boring ones. It was packing a lunch instead of buying one on a Tuesday when I was exhausted and didn't feel like it. It was turning down a girls' trip to Savannah 2 years running, telling my friends I had a thing, when the truth was I couldn't justify the flight. It was a second-hand couch I kept for 6 years because a new one would have cost $400 I'd already mentally assigned to the house fund. My coworker Naomi used to tease me, not unkindly, calling me the most boring woman in Hamilton County. I used to laugh and say I'd rather be boring at 30 and free at 40 than the other way around. I didn't know, back then, how literally that trade would get tested. There's a specific memory I keep returning to from that stretch of years, a Tuesday afternoon at the office when a patient, a woman about my mother's age, made an offhand comment while I was cleaning her teeth about how her own daughter still lived at home at 31, borrowing a little here and there, and how she didn't mind because that's what family's for. I remember nodding along the way you do with a patient's mouth propped open, unable to really respond, and thinking, distantly, that I was grateful my own family wasn't like that. I think about the irony of that moment often now. The house wasn't much to look at, a 1962 bungalow with a leaning porch rail and a kitchen that hadn't been touched since the Reagan administration. But it had good bones, a detached garage I planned to convert into a small rental unit for extra income, and a backyard with a maple tree old enough to have its own gravity. My grandmother, Iris, left me $19,000 when she passed 2 years earlier, money she'd saved from decades of cutting hair out of her kitchen. I put almost all of it toward the down payment. The day I got the keys, I sat alone on the empty living room floor and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry at her funeral. It felt like she'd handed me something solid to stand on. I remember calling my mother from that same spot on the floor, still crying, and her saying, "Oh, honey, that's wonderful," in a voice that sounded genuinely happy for me. I want to hold on to that memory carefully, because I think it was real. Whatever came later, that moment, my mother's unguarded happiness on the phone, no agenda in it yet, was true. I should tell you a little about Iris, because she matters to this story in a way that isn't obvious at first. She raised 4 kids on a hairdresser's income after my grandfather left, and she never once, in my memory, asked anyone to bail her out of anything. She used to say, "A house is the one thing nobody can talk you out of once it's yours." I didn't understand at the time that she might have been speaking from experience, my mother told me, years later, that Iris had once let a cousin stay a few months in her spare room in the 70s, and that cousin had stayed almost 2 years before Iris finally, calmly, changed the locks. I wish I'd asked her more about it while she was alive. I think she would have recognized exactly what was happening to me long before I did. I also think, looking back, that Iris's money, the $19,000 that became my down payment, was never really about the dollar amount. It was about a woman who had lived through exactly this kind of erosion once, quietly making sure her granddaughter would never have to depend on anyone else's goodwill for a roof. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it might have been the whole point. My father, Roger, spent 26 years on the line at an auto parts plant before it closed in 2019. He never quite found steady work after that, some contract jobs, a stint driving for a delivery service that didn't last. My mother, Diane, works part-time at a pharmacy counter. They're not bad people. I want to say that clearly, because it matters for everything that comes after. They are people who love hard and worry harder, and who never quite learned how to say no to my younger brother, Kyle. My father, in particular, has always defined himself through providing. Losing the plant job wasn't just a financial blow to him, it was, I think, a wound to something deeper, some sense of who he was supposed to be in this family. I didn't understand that fully until much later, when I could look back at everything that happened with more distance. A man who has spent his whole adult life being the one who solves problems doesn't stop needing to solve them just because he's lost the income to do it responsibly. I remember being maybe 10 years old, watching my father help a neighbor rebuild a porch for an entire weekend, refusing payment even when the man tried 3 separate times to hand him cash. My mother wasn't angry about it, exactly, but I remember her saying quietly, once he was out of earshot, "Your father would give away the roof over our heads if someone asked him with the right story." I didn't understand, at 10, that she meant it as a warning as much as an observation. I think about that porch a lot now. It was the same instinct, decades later, that led him to trace my signature onto a loan document, not greed, not malice, just an old, deeply grooved habit of solving other people's problems with whatever he had access to, even when what he had access to wasn't really his. Kyle is 29. He's tried 3 businesses, a food truck, a phone repair kiosk, and most recently an online resale operation that never turned a profit. Each time, my parents quietly absorbed the loss. I don't think they ever sat down and decided to enable him. I think it happened the way most family patterns happen, one small rescue at a time, until the rescuing became the relationship. I remember being maybe 26, sitting at their kitchen table, half joking that I should start a failing business too, since it seemed to come with better financial support than being the responsible one did. My mother laughed it off. "You don't need it, honey, you've always had your head on straight." I took that as a compliment for years before I understood it as something closer to an assignment, the role I'd been handed and expected to keep playing, no matter what it cost me. The food truck failed first, in a way that was almost gentle, a slow bleed of permit fees and a commissary kitchen contract that never quite worked out, until Kyle simply stopped mentioning it and moved on to something else. The phone repair kiosk was worse, a mall lease he couldn't get out of, 6 months of losses my parents covered without ever telling me the total. By the time the resale business started, I'd stopped asking for numbers, because I think some part of me already understood I wouldn't like the answer, and I didn't want to be the one who made my parents say it out loud. 4 months after I closed on the house, my parents' apartment building had a pipe failure in the unit above theirs. Water came through the ceiling, ruined the carpet, and the property manager told them it would take 2 to 3 weeks minimum to remediate the mold risk. My mother called me on a Tuesday night, and I remember exactly what she said, because I wrote it in my phone notes afterward, the way I write down things at work. "We just need somewhere dry for a couple weeks, honey. We wouldn't get in your way at all." I wasn't living in the house yet myself, I was still at my boyfriend Marcus's apartment while I got quotes on the kitchen and bathroom, planning to move in once the worst of the renovation dust settled. The house was, functionally, empty. It felt cruel to say no. Marcus and I had been together 3 years by then, and he's not a man who inserts himself into other people's family decisions easily. But that night, after I hung up with my mother, he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "You know, once they're in, there's no clean version of asking them to leave, right?" I remember feeling defensive on my parents' behalf, telling him it was only a couple of weeks, that he didn't know them the way I did. He didn't push it further. He just said, "Okay. I hope I'm wrong." I think about that conversation often now, how easily I dismissed the one person in my life who had no stake in keeping the peace with my family, and every reason to just tell me the truth. I asked him once, much later, why he hadn't pushed harder that night. He told me he'd learned, from watching his own sister go through something similar with their parents, that pointing at a pattern too early just makes the person defend it instead of seeing it. "You had to get there yourself," he said. "I just didn't want to be the reason you dug in." I think he was right, even though I wish, some days, that I hadn't needed quite so long a runway to get there. I want to be fair to my parents here, because I've thought about this part more than any other. They didn't sit down and plan to take over my house. What happened, I think, is smaller and more human than that. They moved in with 2 suitcases and a cat carrier. Then Roger brought over his recliner, since the apartment's damp anyway. Then Diane started keeping her prescription bottles in my medicine cabinet just for now. Every individual step was reasonable. It was the accumulation that wasn't. I didn't see it happening in real time. I saw text messages that each, on their own, sounded like nothing. Insurance is being slow, might be another few weeks. Landlord says mold remediation is way worse than they thought. Kyle's lease fell through. Is it okay if he crashes in the garage apartment while you're not living there yet? Just till he's back on his feet. I said yes to that last one too. I remember typing it and feeling a small, private unease, the kind you talk yourself out of because you don't want to be the difficult one in the family. Kyle moved into the garage apartment I had been planning to renovate and rent out for $900 a month. Income one had already built into my budget for the mortgage. Around month 4, I stopped by on a weeknight to drop off a space heater my mother had asked for, and noticed my father's name had been added to the mailbox, in his own handwriting, beneath mine, on a strip of masking tape. I remember standing on the porch looking at it for longer than the moment deserved. It wasn't malicious. It was practical, mail was getting delivered there, after all. But something about seeing his name under mine, in his handwriting, on my mailbox, sat wrong in a way I couldn't fully explain yet, even to myself. That same week, I noticed the porch light timer had been reset to a schedule that matched my parents' old routine, not mine. A small thing. I didn't say anything. I remember thinking, almost proudly, that I wasn't going to be the kind of person who kept score over a porch light. I didn't understand yet that not keeping score and not noticing are 2 very different things, and that I was quietly doing the second while telling myself I was doing the first. Somewhere around month 5, I got a strange, brief call from a man who introduced himself as a supplier for Kyle's resale business, asking if the Halloway residence, my address, was still the right shipping location for a return dispute. I told him I wasn't sure what he meant, and he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd been trying to reach the family about an outstanding balance for weeks. I didn't think much of it at the time beyond mild confusion. I mentioned it to my mother that weekend, and she brushed past it quickly. "Oh, that's just some mix-up with his supplier account, don't worry about it," in a tone that, looking back, was working a little too hard to sound unconcerned. I want to mention something that doesn't usually make it into stories like this one. What it's like to keep showing up for your actual job while your home life quietly unravels. I never called in sick over any of it. I never let a patient see anything but a calm, competent hygienist asking them to open wider. There's a strange discipline to that kind of compartmentalizing, and I got very good at it, in a way I'm not sure I'm proud of. Our office manager, Dr. Whitlow, commented once, kindly, that I seemed a little tired lately, and I told her I just wasn't sleeping well, which was true, though not in the way she meant. I think a lot of people carrying something heavy learn to answer the surface version of the question, because the real version takes longer than a hallway conversation allows. By month 7, I still hadn't moved into my own house. Every time I raised it, there was a new complication. My father had started referring to it, in front of neighbors, as our place. My mother had rearranged the kitchen, my kitchen, the one I'd chosen the paint color for myself, a soft sage green, into a layout that matched the apartment they'd left behind. Kyle's name was on a piece of mail I found in the entryway, a subscription box addressed to Kyle Halloway, 214, Larkspur Street. Not care of. Just his name on my address, like it was simply where he lived now, no qualifier needed. I texted my mother, "Hey, when do you think you'll be back in your own place? I was hoping to move in this fall." She replied 3 hours later, "Let's talk about it when things settle down. It's a lot right now with your dad's blood pressure." Around this same stretch, my father called me one evening just to talk, the way he used to before any of this started, no request attached, no complication to explain. We talked for almost 40 minutes about a fishing trip he was planning with an old coworker, about a documentary he'd watched, about nothing important at all. I remember hanging up feeling unexpectedly happy, and then, a few minutes later, feeling guilty for how much that ordinary conversation had meant to me, as if I'd been starving for something I hadn't realized I was missing. It made the rest of what was happening harder to hold on to with any clarity, because he was still, underneath everything, still my father, still capable of an easy 40-minute conversation about fish. I think that's part of why it took so long for me to act, not confusion about what was happening, but reluctance to let go of a version of him that hadn't disappeared, just gotten harder to find. An older woman named Grace Okafor lived 2 doors down and had watched me haul paint cans and drywall samples up my own front steps the spring I bought the house. That same month, 7 months in, she stopped me at the mailbox and said, kindly, without meaning any harm at all, "It's so nice your parents finally got to retire into a place like this." I smiled and said something non-committal, and drove away with my hands shaking slightly on the wheel. It was the first time I understood that from the outside, to anyone who didn't know the timeline, this already looked like their house. Not mine. I had become, in less than a year, the daughter who was letting her parents live somewhere, instead of the woman who owned it. I sat with that conversation for days afterward. I kept replaying the word finally, as if my parents moving into my house had been some long-awaited, natural conclusion rather than an emergency measure that had quietly outlived its own justification 11 times over. I didn't correct Mrs. Okafor. I've wondered since whether that small failure to correct the record, again and again, with neighbor after relative after coworker, was its own kind of consent, not to what my parents were doing, exactly, but to the story everyone around me had already decided to believe. Here's the moment I think of as an early low point, though it doesn't sound dramatic when I say it out loud. I drove over on a Sunday to get a box of my own dishes out of the garage, dishes that had belonged to my grandmother, and found that the code on the garage keypad had been changed. I called my father. He said, easily, like it wasn't strange at all, "Oh, we had to change it, Kyle kept forgetting the old one." I stood in my own driveway, next to my own maple tree, unable to get into my own garage, and my father talked to me like I was the one being unreasonable for wanting in. I didn't yell. I didn't even really argue. I said, "Can you text me the new code?" And he did, 20 minutes later, and that was the whole confrontation. I drove home and didn't cry until I was in the car, which is, I've come to understand, a very specific and very common kind of grief, the kind you're not allowed to have because nothing technically happened. The lowest point, though, came a few weeks later, at Thanksgiving. I arrived to my own house to find the table set with dishes I didn't recognize, seating already assigned, and my father standing at the head of the table where my grandfather used to sit at family gatherings, carving a turkey in a kitchen that still had my paint on the walls. Someone, I never found out who, had put out a hand-lettered place card that said Erin at a spot near the far end, past 2 cousins I barely saw anymore. I sat where I was told to sit, in my own dining room, and smiled through a dinner where 3 separate relatives thanked my parents for hosting. I didn't correct anyone. I told myself it wasn't worth the scene. I drove home to Marcus's apartment that night and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside, because I didn't have the words yet for what I was feeling, only the shape of it. Marcus didn't ask me anything that night. He just sat next to me on the couch until I was ready to talk, and when I finally described the place card, the seating, the thank you for hosting, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, very gently, Erin, that's not your family being close. That's your family forgetting whose house this is. I didn't respond. I think some part of me already knew he was right, and I just wasn't ready yet to build a plan around that truth. My cousin Leah, who'd sat at that Thanksgiving table 2 seats down from the place card with my name on it, texted me a few days later, almost apologetically, hey, this is probably none of my business, but is everything okay with the house situation? Aunt Diane talks about it like it's permanent now. I didn't respond for a full day, unsure how to answer without sounding like I was airing family business to someone I only saw twice a year. When I finally wrote back, I kept it simple, working on a timeline. It's been a lot longer than planned. Leah's reply stuck with me. For what it's worth, from the outside it just looks like your parents live there now. I don't think anyone means anything by it. But that's what it looks like. It was the second time in a month someone with no stake in the outcome had told me, gently, that the story I was still calling temporary had already changed shape in everyone else's eyes. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I sat my parents down at their old kitchen table, my kitchen table, now, and asked plainly when they were moving back to their own place, since their insurance claim had, I'd learned from my mother's own Facebook post, actually settled 2 months earlier. I'd rehearsed the conversation in the car on the way over, trying to find language that was firm without sounding like an accusation. I opened with the insurance settlement, laying it out as a simple fact rather than a confrontation. I saw the claim closed back in September, so I wanted to talk about timing, hoping a factual opening would keep things calm. My father got defensive first. You've done this before, made a big thing out of nothing. We're your parents. I told him I wasn't trying to make anything into a big thing, that I just needed an actual date, something I could plan around. He waved a hand like the request itself was the problem. My mother tried a softer angle. We didn't think it would actually be that big a deal, Erin. It's not like we're strangers living here. I said, as evenly as I could, that it wasn't about being strangers, it was about the plans I'd made, the renovation timeline, the rental income from the garage apartment, my own move-in date, all of which had quietly evaporated over 11 months without anyone acknowledging it out loud. My mother looked down at the table when I said that, and for a moment I thought we might actually get somewhere. Then my father changed the subject to Kyle's job search, and the moment passed. Kyle, when I brought it up separately, over the phone a few days later, said, I don't understand where this is coming from. I thought we were fine. I told him fine wasn't really the standard I was going for, and he went quiet, clearly unsure what to do with a sentence that wasn't an accusation but also wasn't reassurance. Nobody apologized. Nobody offered a date. What I got instead was a kind of gentle, unified confusion, as if I were the one who had changed the rules. I remember driving home that night composing, in my head, all the things I should have said instead, the settled insurance claim, the 11 months, the mailbox, the place card. I said none of them out loud. I told myself I'd bring it up again when things were calmer, a phrase I now recognize as almost identical to the one my mother had been using on me the entire time. My coworker Naomi Ferris has worked the front desk at our dental office for 6 years, and she's the kind of friend who says the thing you're avoiding saying to yourself. We got lunch that same week, and I told her the whole thing, trying to sound reasonable, trying to make my parents sound reasonable. She put her sandwich down and said, Erin, you worked 8 years for that house. Your dad renamed it our place in under a year. Do you hear how that sounds? I didn't have a good answer. She reached across the table and said something I've thought about many times since, you're allowed to want your own house back. That's not a betrayal. That's just true. It was the first time anyone had said it to me without softening it, and something in my chest loosened, just slightly, hearing it out loud. Naomi told me something else that day, too, that I didn't fully appreciate until later. She said her own mother had lived with her family for 8 months after a divorce years earlier, and the thing that had finally worked wasn't an argument, it was a specific, written date, agreed to calmly, before either of them was upset enough to make it personal. Do it before you're furious, she told me. furious never works. Calm and specific works. I wrote that down on a napkin, which I still have, folded up in a kitchen drawer. That night I told Marcus about the lunch with Naomi, and about Thanksgiving, all of it, in more detail than I'd let myself say out loud before. He listened without interrupting, which is its own kind of gift, and when I finished he asked me a single question: what would you tell one of your patients if they described this exact situation to you? I didn't have an answer right away. He didn't push. He just let the question sit there, unanswered, on the coffee table between us, until I finally said, quietly, I'd tell them to set a real deadline. He nodded and said, okay. So set one. I did, that week, a specific date, 6 weeks out, sent in a calm, plainly worded text to both my parents. I want to be honest that I almost didn't send it 3 separate times before I finally did. My finger hovered over the message for what felt like a full minute. When I finally pressed send, I put my phone face down on the counter and didn't look at it again for 2 hours, because I was afraid of what the response would be, and afraid, in a smaller and stranger way, of what it would mean about me if I didn't follow through this time. My mother's reply, when I finally read it, was 3 words: we'll talk soon. Not a yes. Not a no. A deflection dressed up as an agreement. My father didn't respond to the text at all. He called me 2 days later and spent most of the conversation talking about a new lead on an apartment he was looking into, a lead that, I'd later learn, he'd never actually followed up on. I remember hanging up the phone that night and feeling, for the first time, something less like hurt and more like clarity. The deadline hadn't fixed anything. But it had told me something true, that no deadline that depended on my parents' voluntary follow-through was ever going to hold. The month between the deadline that didn't hold and Patricia's phone call was, strangely, one of the calmer stretches of the whole ordeal. I stopped bringing up moving dates. I think, looking back, I had entered a kind of exhausted holding pattern, not accepting the situation, exactly, but not actively fighting it either. I started spending more nights at Marcus's apartment even on weekends I'd normally have gone to my parents for dinner, telling myself I was just busy with work. Naomi noticed the pattern before I named it to myself. You're avoiding your own house, she said one lunch, not unkindly. She wasn't wrong. I didn't know, yet, that the thing that would finally break the standstill wasn't going to come from me at all. I need to introduce someone here who had absolutely nothing to do with my family, and everything to do with what happened next. Patricia Nguyen has worked as a loan officer at Meridian Credit Union for 14 years. She helped my grandmother refinance her house back in 2003, and she was the same loan officer who'd approved my own mortgage the year before. She knew our family only the way a longtime banker knows longtime customers, a friendly face at the counter, someone who remembered your name and asked about your holidays. She had no idea what was happening at 214 Larkspur Street. She was simply doing her job, on an ordinary Thursday, working through a queue of pending applications. I was at work, between patients, when my cell phone rang with the credit union's number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Patricia's voice was warm and businesslike, the way it always was. Hi, Erin, it's Patricia over at Meridian. I'm just doing a final income verification on your home equity line of credit application. I show your submitted pay stubs here, but I need to confirm your current employer directly since it's a larger draw amount than we usually process without a callback. I stood very still in the hallway outside exam room 2. I'm sorry, my what? Your HELOC application. Submitted Monday. $38,000 draw against 214 Larkspur Street. A pause. Erin, is everything okay? I told her I hadn't applied for anything. Patricia didn't raise her voice or speculate. That's not how banks work, and it's not how she works. She simply told me, factually, what was in front of her. An application had been submitted online 3 days earlier, using my social security number, my property, and what she described as a signature on the notarized authorization that doesn't match the one we have on file from your original mortgage closing. She said she'd need to flag the file for their internal fraud review before anything could move forward, and that she was legally required to inform me since my name and property were involved, regardless of who had submitted it. "I don't want to jump to conclusions," she said carefully, "but I have to ask, do you know who else has access to your personal documents?" I thought about the mail addressed to Kyle. I thought about the garage code. I thought about my father saying our place to the neighbors, and the hand-lettered place card at my own Thanksgiving table. And I said, quietly, I think I might. I stayed in that hallway outside exam room longer than I should have. Patricia had been kind enough to stay on the line while I processed it, repeating the key details slowly: the amount, the date the application was submitted, the note about the mismatched signature, as if she understood, without my having to say it, that I needed to hear it more than once before it would fully land. I remember asking her, almost involuntarily, "Are you sure it's not just a system error, some kind of mix-up?" and her answering, gently but without hedging, "The signature discrepancy is flagged by 2 separate reviewers, Erin. This isn't an error." I thanked her, hung up, and stood there for a full minute just breathing, running through 11 months of small, explainable inconveniences and understanding, all at once, that at least one piece of the story had never been an accident at all. I don't remember much of the rest of that shift. I finished my last 2 patients on autopilot, smiling, asking about flossing habits, while some other part of my mind was replaying 11 months of small compromises, trying to fit them into this new, uglier shape. Naomi noticed something was wrong before I said a word, just from the way I was cleaning my station. I told her in the break room, in a low voice, and she didn't say, "I told you so," even though she would have been entitled to. She just squeezed my arm and said, "Okay. Now you call a lawyer." Today. I confronted my father first, alone, that same evening. He didn't deny it the way I expected. He looked, for the first time in this entire ordeal, genuinely frightened. "It was supposed to help you too," he said. "Kyle's supplier was going to sue him. We were going to pay it back before you even noticed." He'd found an old utility bill with my signature on it and traced it, he admitted, onto the notarized form. He hadn't thought of it as forgery. He'd thought of it as borrowing, the same word he'd used, I realized, for 11 months of living in my house. My mother's reaction was different: denial, at first, insisting Roger must have misunderstood the paperwork, then, when the facts didn't move, a long silence, and finally, I told him it was a bad idea. "I should have called you myself." It was the closest thing to an apology I got from her that week. Kyle's reaction was the hardest for me. He cried on the phone and said he never asked Dad to forge anything, that he only mentioned the supplier's threat in passing. I believed him. I also understood, hearing it, that the forgery hadn't come from cruelty. It had come from a father who had spent a decade rescuing his son and had simply run out of legitimate ways to do it again. Patricia called me back 4 days later with an update, purely procedural, delivered in the same even tone as before. Meridian's internal fraud department had confirmed what she'd flagged: the notarization had, in fact, been falsified. The notary listed on the form had no record of ever meeting with either of my parents, a detail uncovered simply by the credit union cross-checking the notary's own logbook as standard practice. The application was denied outright, and the file was closed on their end without any further obligation from me. Patricia was careful, throughout, to keep the conversation entirely factual. "I just wanted you to have closure on our part of this," she said. "What you do next is yours to decide." It was, I realized afterward, the exact opposite of everything that had happened in my own house for the past 11 months, a straightforward, honest accounting of facts, offered without an agenda. My attorney, a calm, precise woman named Grace Delacroix, who specializes in residential real estate and landlord-tenant law, walked me through my options within days of Patricia's call. Because the HELIC application had already been flagged as fraudulent by the credit union's own internal review, no criminal complaint needed from me at that stage, just their compliance department's standard procedure. Grace's focus was narrower and more practical: getting my parents and Kyle, all 3 long past any reasonable definition of temporary guests, out of a home that was legally, entirely mine. We held one formal meeting at Grace's office. My parents sat across the table looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. Grace laid out the timeline plainly: a written 30-day notice to vacate, already sent by certified mail the week before, and what would happen if the date passed without action. She wasn't cruel about it. She was, like Patricia, simply accurate. This isn't punitive, she told them. It's what the law requires when informal arrangements don't resolve on their own. My father asked, quietly, if there was another way. Grace said there wasn't, not at this point, not after 4 verbal requests and 1 blocked garage code. My mother didn't say anything at all. She just looked at her hands. I told Naomi about the meeting with Grace the next day at work, expecting her to be relieved that I'd finally taken formal steps. Instead, she asked me a question I wasn't ready for: how do you feel about it? Not what's right, not what's fair. How do you actually feel? I didn't have a clean answer. I told her I felt like I was watching myself do something necessary and terrible at the same time, and she nodded like that was exactly the answer she'd expected. That's normal, she said. Doing the right thing with people you love almost never feels like relief right away. It just feels like wait, for a while, before it feels like anything else. I've thought about that distinction often since, the difference between something being correct and something feeling good, and how long the gap between those two things can stretch. The 30 days passed the way I imagine anyone's does when they don't believe the deadline is real. My father called twice, each time circling towards some version of "you wouldn't actually go through with it." My mother sent a long text about family and forgiveness that I read 3 times and didn't answer. Kyle, to his credit, moved out of the garage apartment in the 2nd week, into a friend's spare room, and texted me only once, "I'm sorry I let it get this far. I should have said something months ago." I believed that one, too. My father, until the very end, did not believe the sheriff would actually come. That belief, I think, was the truest window into how the whole situation had happened in the first place, a decade of assuming that consequences were things that happened to other families. 6 days before the deadline, my mother showed up at the dental office unannounced, waiting in the parking lot after my shift. She looked tired in a way that wasn't performative, and for a moment I almost let myself soften completely. She asked if there was any version of this where I'd let it slide, just extend the date a little, let things settle naturally. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that "settling naturally" was the exact phrase she'd used 11 months earlier, and that I didn't believe in it anymore. She nodded, didn't argue, and got back in her car. I watched her drive away and felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet, not triumph, not even relief. Just a tired, quiet sadness, the kind that comes from watching someone you love finally run out of ways to avoid the truth. 2 days after that, my father's sister, my Aunt Sandra, called me, not to defend him, as I'd braced for, but to tell me a story I'd never heard before. She told me that decades earlier, my father had co-signed a car loan for a friend who never made a single payment, and had quietly covered it himself for 2 years rather than admit the mistake to my grandfather. "He's always been like this," she said. "He'd rather absorb the damage than let anyone see he made a bad call." I think that's what's happening with Kyle. I don't think it's really about you at all. It didn't change my decision. But it gave me a strange, unexpected softness toward my father that I carried into the final days of the process, a softness I hadn't expected to feel and didn't try to talk myself out of. I didn't sleep much the night before day 31. I kept running through Grace's explanation of exactly what would happen, the deputy, the writ, the 72-hour window, trying to picture it happening to my own parents and finding that no amount of rehearsal made it feel real in advance. Marcus stayed up with me for a while, not saying much, just present. Around midnight I asked him if he thought I was doing the right thing, and he said, "I think you're doing the only thing that was left," after 11 months of asking nicely didn't work. It wasn't an especially comforting answer. It was, however, an accurate one, and accuracy was what I needed most that night, more than comfort. On day 31, a sheriff's deputy, a soft-spoken man named Deputy Alan Reyes who had, coincidentally, coached my old rec league softball team 15 years earlier and recognized my last name on the paperwork, knocked on the door of 214, Larkspur Street and handed my father a single envelope, the writ of possession, ordering the property vacated within 72 hours, with law enforcement authorized to remove any remaining occupants and belongings after that window closed. I wasn't there. Grace called me afterward to let me know it had been served without incident. My father, she said, had gone very quiet and simply asked the deputy, "Is this really happening?" Deputy Reyes told him, kindly but plainly, that it was, and that he hoped everything worked out for the family. There was no shouting. No scene. Just an envelope changing hands on a porch I had painted myself, the summer before, a soft gray-blue I'd chosen alone on a Saturday afternoon. I drove over on the third day, the day the 72 hours expired, not because I had to, but because I didn't want my parents' last hours in that house to be entirely alone. My father was loading his recliner into a rented truck. He didn't look at me when I first walked up, and for a moment I thought he might not speak to me at all. Then he set down the box he was carrying and said, "I know I don't get to ask this, but I hope you know none of this was ever really about the house." I told him I believed that. I did, and I still do. It didn't change anything about the outcome, but it mattered to hear. My mother, folding a stack of towels into a laundry basket, stopped when she saw me and said only, "The kitchen's clean." I made sure of that, at least. It was such a small thing to say, after everything, but I understood it as its own kind of apology, the only language she had left for what she couldn't yet say directly. My parents moved into a small apartment 11 days later. They found housing faster than the original insurance timeline had ever promised, which told me something about how much of the delay had never really been about the pipe at all. My father called me the week after they moved, not to apologize exactly, but to ask if he could come by and recaulk the upstairs bathroom, a small, practical offering in place of the words he still couldn't quite find. I let him. We didn't talk about the Hellock while he worked. We talked about the Reds bullpen and whether the maple tree needed trimming before winter. My mother started calling every Sunday, a standing habit that hadn't existed before any of this. Small, deliberate, undramatic. Kyle got a job at a warehouse with steady hours and started paying his parents back in $50 increments, which he told me about unprompted, like he needed me to know he was trying. None of it undid the 11 months. But it was specific, and it was real, and it was more than an apology would have been. Kyle and I didn't really talk, one-on-one, until almost 3 months after the move. We met for coffee near his new warehouse job, and he spent most of the first 20 minutes apologizing in circles before I finally told him he didn't need to keep doing that I'd already forgiven the part that was actually his. What he said next surprised me. "I used to think you had it easier than me," he admitted, turning his cup slowly on the table. "Like the house just kind of happened for you." I didn't really let myself think about the 8 years part. I told him it hadn't just happened, and he said, quietly, "Yeah. I get that now." It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. But it was the first fully honest conversation the two of us had had in years, and I've come to value it more than almost anything else that happened in the aftermath. 3 weeks after the envelope, I finally moved into my own house, 13 months after closing on it, in a room I had painted for a version of my life that had taken far longer to arrive than I'd planned. Marcus helped me carry boxes up the same front steps I'd once hauled paint cans up alone. I remember standing in the sage-green kitchen that first night, in a house that had been legally mine the entire time and had never once, until that evening, actually felt like it. I didn't cry the way I had the day I got the keys. It was quieter than that, more like something finally settling into its proper shape. The following December, I hosted Christmas at Larkspur Street myself, for the first time. I set the table. I chose the seating. My father sat where I put him, near the middle, and didn't say a word about it. At one point my mother caught my eye across the room while I was carrying the ham in from the kitchen, and something passed between us, not quite an apology, not quite forgiveness, but an acknowledgement, unspoken, that we both understood exactly what had changed and why. It was, I think, the most honest moment we'd had together in over a year, and neither of us said a single word about it out loud. Later that night, after everyone had gone, my father lingered in the doorway for a moment before leaving and said, "Your grandmother would be proud of this kitchen." I told him I thought so too. It wasn't a resolution. It was smaller than that, and somehow more honest for being small. It's been just over a year now since the envelope. My parents are settled into their apartment in a way that suggests they've genuinely made peace with it, not just tolerated it. My mother has redecorated twice, which I've come to understand is her version of putting down roots. My father recocks something at Larkspur Street every couple of months, always finding some small maintenance task as his excuse to visit, and I've stopped needing him to say more than that. Kyle still texts me photos of his paycheck stubs sometimes, unprompted, like small offerings of proof. None of us has ever sat down and had one clean, cinematic conversation where everything gets said. I used to think that kind of conversation was necessary for real healing. I don't think that anymore. I think most families heal the way mine did, in recocked bathrooms and Sunday phone calls and a father quietly acknowledging, once, on a moving day, that it was never really about the house. I've thought a great deal, since then, about why it took me 11 months and a stranger's phone call to say the thing I should have said in month 2. I think the truth is that families teach us, often without meaning to, that boundaries are a kind of unkindness. I had been raised to be the reasonable one, the low-maintenance one, the one who didn't make waves, and that training made me almost unable to see that reasonable had quietly become erased. It wasn't my parents' forgery that woke me up. It was Naomi, at a lunch table, refusing to let me talk myself out of my own reality. Sometimes the people who love you the most are the ones least equipped to tell you the truth, and the people with no stake at all, a friend, a boyfriend asking one honest question, a loan officer just doing her job, end up being the ones who hand it back to you. If you're in the early version of this story right now, if someone you love is living in your space on a temporary basis that keeps quietly extending, I'd tell you this, put a date on it, in writing, the first time. Not because you expect the worst, but because clarity is kinder to everyone than silent resentment. Watch for the small signs before they become the big ones, a name added to a mailbox, a changed keypad code, a seat you're no longer assigned at your own table. None of those things are proof of anything on their own. But together, they're a pattern, and patterns deserve to be trusted before you need a stranger to confirm them for you. I'd also say this, don't wait for the version of the situation that feels dramatic enough to justify a boundary. I spent months telling myself that what was happening to me wasn't bad enough to make a fuss about. Nobody was cruel to my face, nobody screamed, nobody did anything you could point to as obviously wrong in a single moment. That's exactly what made it so hard to name. Slow erosion rarely announces itself. It just quietly redraws the map until the place you're standing doesn't feel like yours anymore, and you're left wondering if you're allowed to ask for it back. You are. You don't need a forged signature or a sheriff's visit to justify wanting your own life back on your own terms. I just happened to get one anyway. And if you're the parent in this story instead of the daughter, if you recognize any part of my father in yourself, the reflex to solve a problem quietly rather than admit you can't solve it at all, I'd ask you to consider saying the harder, more honest thing sooner. My father's forgery didn't come from malice. It came from a man who had run out of legitimate ways to keep being the person he thought he was supposed to be, and chose a shortcut instead of a conversation. The conversation would have cost him less, in the end, than the shortcut did. Naomi and I had lunch again recently, almost exactly a year after the first one where she told me I was allowed to want my own house back. I told her how strange it felt, looking back, that the turning point in my entire family's dynamic had come down to a bank's routine compliance procedure rather than anything I'd said or done myself. She thought about that for a moment and said, maybe. Or maybe you'd already done the hard part by the time that call came, you'd already sent the deadline, already told your parents the truth once, even if it didn't work right away. The bank just gave you a reason you couldn't talk yourself out of using it. I've turned that idea over many times since. I don't think the phone call created my resolve. I think it just removed the last excuse I'd been giving myself not to use it. I don't think of my father as a villain, even now. I think of him as a man who loved his son so specifically that he lost track of what belonged to his daughter. I think of my mother as someone who chose peace over honesty for 11 months, the way a lot of us do, until peace and honesty stop being options you can choose between. I still have Sunday dinners with them. The house on Larkspur Street is quiet again, and mine, in the ordinary way houses are supposed to be, my sage green kitchen, my grandmother's dishes back on their shelf, the garage apartment finally rented to a graduate student who pays on the first of every month, no questions, no envelopes, no name I didn't put there myself. If you've ever had to draw a line with people you love, and watched it take far longer than it should have to be respected, I'd love to hear how it happened, and what changed afterward. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.